she knew she was going to die. Not in the vague, abstract way that we all understand our lives will one day end, but in the specific, bone-deep way that a woman knows when the danger inside her own home has become something she cannot outrun. She borrowed money from her mother to change her locks. She begged her siblings to help her get a gun. She was doing everything a woman with limited options and limited time could do to keep herself and her little girl alive. It didn't work. On the night of March 8, 1982, in Abilene, Texas, a 30-year-old mother named Susan "FLORES" Brown and her 8-year-old daughter, Francesca Antoinette Martinez, a little girl everyone called Cha-Cha, were murdered inside their own home. And the man investigators believed was responsible walked out of that house, walked past the police tape, and walked freely through the streets of Abilene for the next 41 years. This is their story, and it is finally, after 4.5 decades, getting the ending it deserves. Before we go any further into this case, if you are new to this channel, welcome to True Crime Exposed. Hit that subscribe button right now and ring the notification bell so you never miss a story. Drop a like on this video if you believe that cold cases deserve to stay open until every last question has been answered. And leave a comment below telling us where in the world you are watching from tonight. Now let's get into it. Abilene, Texas, in the spring of 1982, was the kind of place that felt permanent. It had the slow, dependable rhythm of a mid-sized West Texas city. Wide streets, modest neighborhoods, the kind of community where people left their doors unlocked and assumed that the worst things in the world happened somewhere else. It sat 180 miles due west of Dallas, far enough from the city to feel like its own world, close enough to the rest of Texas that it kept up with the times. South Bowie Street was one of those neighborhoods where porches stayed lit in the evenings and neighbors knew each other's first names. Kids played outside past dinner. People waved when they drove past. There was nothing about the block, nothing about the house at 1300 South Bowie Street that would have made a stranger slow down and look twice. But inside that house, something had been building for a long time. Susan "FLORES" Brown was 30 years old. She was Latina, deeply rooted in her family, and by all accounts, a woman who knew how to love people well. She had a social life, friends, evenings out. She was not someone who had retreated from the world. Her sisters, Linda Flores and Rita Flores Lafferty, were her closest confidants, the people who knew the full picture of her life, including the part she didn't broadcast to everyone. And the full picture was frightening. In the weeks leading up to her death, Susanna had been trying to build a wall between herself and something, or someone, she was terrified of. She went to her mother and asked to borrow money, not for rent or food or any of the ordinary needs that come with raising a child, but specifically to have the locks on her house changed. She went to her siblings and asked them to help her acquire a gun. These were not the requests of a woman going through a rough patch. These were the requests of a woman who believed her life was in danger and was trying, within the narrow limits available to her, to do something about it. She was sharing a home with a man named Billy A. Brown. He was not Francesca's biological father. And what happened in that house when Billy Brown got angry was something that 8-year-old Francesca had learned to navigate in the only way a child can, by making herself invisible. Family members would later recall that when tension rose in the house, when Brown's anger filled the rooms and pressed against the walls, little Cha-Cha had a habit. She would slip away. She would get down on the floor and slide herself under the bed, curling up in that dark, narrow space and waiting for whatever was happening above her to pass. She was 8 years old, and she had already built herself a hiding place. The evening of Monday, March 8th, began as an ordinary night. Susanna went out to a Tupperware party at an acquaintance's house, the kind of low-key social event that was enormously popular in that era, an evening of small talk and product, demonstrations, and the kind of easy company that makes a week feel lighter. While she was out, Francesca was staying at the home of a woman named Kathy Spivey. When Susanna arrived to collect her daughter and bring her home, Francesca asked something that Kathy has never forgotten. She asked if she could stay the night. She did not want to go home. Kathy told her no. Maybe she didn't think anything of it at the time. Maybe she assumed Francesca was just being a child, stalling, the way children do when they're comfortable somewhere and not ready to leave. Whatever the reasoning, Kathy took Francesca back to her mother, and Susanna took her home. That was the last time either of them was seen alive by anyone outside that house. In the early hours of March 9th, 1982, at 3:30 in the morning, a 911 call was made from the house at 1300 South Bowie Street. The caller was Billy A. Brown. His voice, every account of that call agrees, was calm, not shaken, not frantic, not the voice of a man who had just walked into his home and found something that no human being should ever have to see. Calm, composed, measured. Brown told dispatchers that he had been working the night shift at a company called New Corp. He said he arrived home at approximately 3:20 in the morning, turned on the lights, and discovered the bodies of Susanna and Francesca. He said he walked past the phone in the living room, past the phone that was right there, went all the way to the kitchen, and called 911 from there. He also noted that the back door was standing open by a few inches when he arrived. Abilene police officers arrived at the scene within minutes. What they found inside that house stayed with every one of them for the rest of their lives and careers. Susanna Brown was found in the bedroom. A lamp cord had been wrapped around her neck. Her skull had been smashed. The kind of violence that speaks not just to the act of killing, but to something personal, something explosive, something fueled by rage that had been building long before that night. She had been sexually assaulted. Her body had been desecrated in ways that investigators described only in the necessary clinical language of official reports, because some things resist ordinary description. Francesca, little Cha-Cha, had been dragged out from under the bed, the one place she always hid, the one place that had always, in her 8 years of life, been the place she went when things got dangerous. Someone had reached under that bed and pulled her out, and a phone cord had been wrapped around her small neck. She was 8 years old. From the very first moments of the investigation, the officers on the scene began noting inconsistencies in Billy Brown's account, things that did not line up with the story he was telling. There were no signs of forced entry anywhere on the property, not at the front door, not at the back door, not at the windows. If an intruder had broken in, they had done so without leaving a single mark of entry. Nothing in the house appeared to have been stolen. A window was open, but the screen was still fully in place and undamaged, meaning no one had come through it. The back door was ajar, but when officers examined the exterior, there were no marks, no damage, nothing to indicate that anyone had forced it open from the outside. The scene did not look like the aftermath of a break-in. It looked like someone had arranged it to look like one. Investigators focused their attention on Billy A. Brown almost immediately. He was living in the house. Susanna had been afraid of someone in her life, afraid enough to change her locks and seek a firearm, and that someone had been Brown. He had made the 911 call with a voice that struck trained law enforcement officers as wrong, too controlled, too steady for what he was claiming to have just experienced. He had walked past one phone to use another, a detail that raised quiet flags among the detectives reconstructing the night. But in 1982, suspicion and circumstantial evidence were not enough to take a case to trial. And while investigators had collected biological evidence from the crime scene, physical samples that were carefully preserved and entered into storage, the forensic science of that era did not have the capability to do what needed to be done with them. The technology simply did not exist yet to extract the answers that were locked inside those samples. No charges were filed against Billy A. Brown. He walked out from under the cloud of that investigation and back into the ordinary flow of daily life. He remained in Abilene. He remained, by all available evidence, completely free. And the years began to pass. The Flores family did not get to move on. Linda and Rita carried the weight of their sister's death and the death of little Cha-Cha through every year that followed, through the 1980s and 90s, through the turn of a century, through all the milestones and ordinary days that kept accumulating while Susanna and Francesca stayed frozen at 30 and 8 years old forever. They had questions that no one could answer and grief that had nowhere to go because there had been no justice, no accountability, no moment in a courtroom where someone stood up and said, "This is what happened, and this is who did it." The case was classified as cold. It remained technically open. Cold cases in Texas do not have a statute of limitations for murder. But in the practical sense, the investigation had stalled. The physical evidence sat in storage. The file sat in the records of the Abilene Police Department, and life, indifferently, kept moving. If you are still watching at this point, stop and drop a comment right now that says, "I am still here." Let us see who is truly following every detail of this story. Because what happens next is where this case stops being just another unsolved murder from the 1980s and becomes something that will restore whatever faith you have left in the idea that the truth eventually surfaces. Hit the like button if you want to see justice for Susanna and Cha-Cha. Now keep watching. Investigators, to their enduring credit, never truly released their grip on this case. There is something important to understand about the culture of homicide investigation, about what it means to a detective to carry an unsolved case. The paperwork may go cold, the leads may dry up, the active investigation may be reduced to a file and a set of stored evidence samples. But detectives who worked a case where a child was murdered, where a young mother was killed in her own home, where the evidence pointed at someone who walked free, those detectives do not simply close the chapter in their minds and walk away from it. They hold on to it. They think about it when they are not at work. They pull the file out when new technology is announced. They make sure, year after year, that the evidence stays preserved and accounted for. That is exactly what happened with the murders of Susanna Brown and Francesca Martinez. The biological samples collected from the crime scene at 1300 South Bowie Street in the early hours of March 9th, 1982, were maintained with the kind of care that represents either institutional diligence or personal determination, most likely both. They were not lost. They were not improperly stored. They did not degrade into uselessness. They waited in the quiet of an evidence storage facility for the moment when the tools to read them would finally exist. Those tools came. Slowly at first, DNA profiling emerged in the mid-1980s, but its early applications were limited, and the techniques grew more sophisticated and more sensitive with every passing decade. What could not be matched in 1990 might be matchable in 2000. What could not be conclusively identified in 2000 might be definitive by 2010. And by the time the 21st century had rolled past its second decade, forensic DNA technology had reached a level of precision and sensitivity that the officers who worked that original crime scene could not have imagined. Then came the television partnership, a program dedicated to reopening cold cases, the kind of production that embeds itself with law enforcement and brings both resources and public attention to investigations that have gone quiet. Made contact with Abilene police about the Brown case. The partnership brought with it not just cameras, but access to forensic analysts working at the very edge of what DNA technology could do. They focused on a single piece of biological evidence. One small sample recovered from that house in 1982 and preserved across more than 4 decades. They submitted it to modern analysis. The results were unambiguous. The DNA profile extracted from that sample matched one individual, not a partial match, not a probable identification, a match of the kind that modern forensic science can produce with a degree of certainty that removes reasonable doubt from the equation. The individual it matched was Billy A. Brown, the same Billy A. Brown who had stood in that house 41 years earlier. The same man who had called 911 with a calm voice at 3:30 in the morning and described arriving home to find the bodies of 2 people he lived with. The same man who had told investigators about the back door being open, about walking past one phone to use another, about coming home from the night shift at New Corp. The same man who had, by all appearances, lived an ordinary life in the city of Abilene for 4 full decades since that night. Investigators moved with the certainty that the evidence now gave them. An arrest was made. Billy A. Brown, now significantly older than the man who had once stood at the center of a murder investigation and walked away from it, was taken into custody. Handcuffs went on the same wrists that had, according to the DNA evidence, committed the murders of a 30-year-old woman and an 8-year-old child more than 4 decades earlier. The FLORES family, who had carried their grief and their unanswered questions through all of those years, through Linda's life and Rita's life, and all the family occasions and ordinary days that passed while Susanna and Cha-Cha were absent from them, finally had an answer. Not the answer anyone wants. There is no version of this answer that gives anyone what they actually want, which is Susanna Brown alive and Francesca Martinez alive, and that night in March of 1982 having never happened. The answer that DNA evidence and an arrest warrant provides is not the restoration of what was taken. It is something smaller and harder won, and still somehow meaningful. It is the confirmation that someone is being held accountable, that the evidence was kept, that the investigators did not let go, that the science eventually caught up to the truth. Let's talk about what this case reveals, because it is not just the story of 2 murders in Abilene, Texas in 1982. It is a story about the way women communicate danger and the way those communications are often not acted upon until it is too late. Susanna Brown was not silent. She was not passive. She was not a woman who did not understand her situation. She understood it precisely. She understood it well enough to go to her mother and say, "I need money to change my locks." She understood it well enough to go to her siblings and say, "I need help getting a gun." She was doing what women in dangerous domestic situations are told to do. She was trying to leave, trying to create barriers, trying to protect herself and her child. And yet she was still in that house on the night of March 8th. She was still, for reasons that may have had everything to do with finances and limited options and the complicated logistics of leaving a dangerous relationship, living under the same roof as the man she was afraid of. This is not a criticism of Susanna Brown. This is a recognition of how these situations work. Leaving is not always possible the moment fear sets in. Changing locks takes money. Getting a gun takes time and resources and access. Building an exit takes planning and support and options that not every woman has in equal measure. Susanna was working towards something. She just did not have enough time. Francesca Antoinette Martinez was 8 years old, and she already knew, in the wordless knowledge of childhood, that the house she lived in was not always safe. She had developed a hiding place. She had learned which sounds and which temperatures in the air meant she should disappear. Children who live in dangerous homes develop these skills the way plants grow toward light, instinctively, necessarily, because survival requires it. On the last night of her life, she did not want to go home. She told Kathy Spivey she wanted to stay. She asked, "A child who does not want to go home is a child who is telling you something. It may not always be something dire. Children want to stay at friends' houses for 100 ordinary reasons. But Francesca's request, viewed in the full context of what was happening inside that house, was a child doing the only thing she could do, asking, in the most direct way available to her, to not be taken back to the place where she was not safe. Kathy Spivey has lived with that night for more than 40 years. She did nothing wrong. She had no way of knowing what was about to happen. She made the reasonable decision that any responsible adult would make when a child asks to sleep over on a school night. The grief she carries is not the product of wrongdoing, but of the terrible randomness of tragedy. The way a completely ordinary decision can become, in retrospect, one of the last branch points before catastrophe. There is also the matter of what 41 years looks like. Billy A. Brown, assuming the DNA evidence is as conclusive as it has been reported to be, and the standard of certainty required for an arrest in a case this significant is extraordinarily high. Billy A. Brown went home from a crime scene. He went home, or went somewhere, and then he kept going. He kept living. He woke up every morning in a world where 2 people he had killed were not waking up. He walked through the streets of Abilene, the same city where the FLORES family lived and grieved and waited for answers, as a free man. 41 years is a long time to carry something. It is long enough to watch the world change beyond recognition. It is long enough for the forensic technology that would eventually undo you to be invented, refined, improved, and applied. It is long enough for a tiny piece of biological evidence, preserved in a storage facility, to accumulate the ability to speak, and when it spoke, it said his name. The thing about cold case investigations that the public sometimes underestimates is the sheer institutional commitment they require. Evidence has to be stored, properly, continuously, across staff changes and budget cycles, and the physical deterioration that time imposes on everything. Files have to be maintained. Institutional memory has to be preserved, or rebuilt when it isn't. Someone has to keep caring about a case that the public has long since stopped thinking about, that generates no headlines and no pressure, and no particular urgency from anyone outside the family of the victims. The Abilene Police Department kept caring. Whoever was responsible for the storage of that evidence across 41 years kept it intact. Whoever made the decision to partner with a television production and submit those samples to modern analysis made a choice that changed everything for the Flores family and for the memory of Susanna and Cha-Cha. These are not dramatic moments, they are bureaucratic ones. They are the decisions made in meeting rooms and evidence storage facilities and conversations between detectives that no camera captures and no one celebrates. But they are the decisions that made justice possible. The case also illustrates something about the nature of forensic science that is worth understanding. DNA technology in the early 1980s was in its infancy. The foundational work that would lead to DNA profiling had barely begun at the time of the murders, and its application to criminal investigation was still years away. Even as the technology developed through the late 1980s and 1990s, it required larger and better preserved samples than many crime scenes produced, and its ability to identify individuals from small or degraded samples was limited. But the technology did not stop developing. Each decade brought new techniques, new levels of sensitivity, new methods for extracting usable profiles from samples that earlier methods could not read. By the 2010s and 2020s, forensic DNA analysis had become capable of producing identifications from quantities and qualities of biological material that would have seemed impossibly small to investigators working a crime scene in 1982. The evidence collected from 1300 South Bowie Street was waiting for exactly this moment. Someone had collected it correctly. Someone had preserved it correctly. And when the moment came, it was still there, still intact, still capable of telling the truth about what had happened inside that house. Susan Flores Brown lived 30 years. She raised a daughter she called Cha-Cha. She had sisters who loved her. She had friends and social evenings and the ordinary accumulated texture of a life being lived. In the weeks before her death, she was afraid, and she was trying to do something about her fear, and she deserves to be remembered as someone who fought for herself and her daughter with everything she had available to her. Francesca Antoinette Martinez lived 8 years. She was called Cha-Cha by everyone who loved her, which was many people. She liked to hide under the bed when things got scary. On the last night of her life, she asked to stay somewhere safe. She was 8 years old, and she was someone's whole world, and she deserved to grow up. Neither of them got enough time. Neither of them got the protection they needed and deserved. And for 41 years, the person investigators believed was responsible for taking them from their family lived free, while Linda and Rita and everyone who loved Susanna and Cha-Cha carried the particular weight of grief that has no resolution. Grief that sits and waits and cannot fully form itself into something you can process and set down, because the story hasn't ended, because no one has been held to account, because the case is still open and the truth is still locked somewhere you cannot reach it. That weight has an answer now. It is not the answer anyone wanted. There is no answer to the question of why that would ever satisfy anyone, and there is no version of justice that returns what was taken. But there is an arrest. There is a name on a DNA report. There is, after 41 years, a reckoning for the Flores family, for Linda and Rita, and everyone who lit a candle in their hearts for Susanna and Cha-Cha across 4 decades. That reckoning is something. It is not enough. It will never be enough. But it is something, and it is what the law and the science and the investigators who refused to fully close this case were able to give them. Preserved evidence does not forget. Science does not have a statute of limitations, and investigators who hold on to a case in the place where professional obligation becomes something more personal, who keep the file close, who make sure the samples stay stored, who say yes when a television production calls and asks if they want to take one more run at it. Those investigators eventually get their moment. This case got its moment. Cha-Cha got her moment. Susanna got hers. If you made it to the end of this story, then you already know that this is the kind of case that deserves to be heard far and wide. Share this video with someone who needs to know that cold cases can be solved, that evidence can last 41 years and still tell the truth, and that the families who wait deserve to see the end of the story. Subscribe to True Crime Exposed if you are not already here. We cover the cases that refuse to stay buried, the stories that the passage of time cannot silence, and the victims whose names should never be forgotten. Drop a comment below with the words "Justice" for Cha-Cha, and let us know that you were here for this one. We will see you in the next story.